Kristen, and you're listening to Podcast and Amplify, a podcast for women entrepreneurs who want to amplify their voice and brand through podcasting and grow a wildly successful business. I'm the executive producer and host of 2 shows and an entrepreneur, and I love helping women grow their visibility, mindset, and business to the next level. Each week, I share tips on how to launch and leverage your podcast, and I'm bringing on the very best business leaders to give you advice on how to build your business empire. Let's amplify your voice and business. Hey listeners, welcome back to the show. So if you've been listening over the last few weeks, you know that this is the last podcast in my 3-part series on how to upgrade your podcast. So this is for those of you who have a podcast. Maybe you started it, you threw it together, and you're realizing there might be some gaps. You're not quite seeing the growth that you wanted to see. Maybe downloads have plateaued, or maybe you didn't throw it together. You were very intentional. You put a lot of time and energy and thought into your show, and it worked for where you were at in your business at the time, but maybe you've pivoted or you've evolved your brand, you've rebranded, done a relaunch, which is so common for us entrepreneurs. We're constantly evolving and trying to, I think, find the right fit. I know that's been the case for me. I constantly keep tweaking my business, and that's perfectly fine. That's why we became entrepreneurs, right? So your podcast might not be quite aligned with what your business looks like today. So this 3-part series I created because I really wanted to give those of you who are in this boat some helpful tips and strategies for really up-leveling your podcast, for maximizing this really powerful content and just getting the most out of it, because I know that there are so many benefits, and you've already invested your time, you've invested your energy, you know that you want to continue to podcast, but you just want those tips of how do I get more downloads? How do I start to attract sponsorships and make some money with this podcast? So in the first episode, if you haven't listened to all 3, the first episode, you might want to go back and listen to episode 62, Does Your Podcast Need an Upgrade? So I share a couple ways for you to assess whether or not your podcast is in need of an upgrade, and 3 ways for you to optimize your podcast to get you that listenership that you are wanting to see, to build more of a community. And then in episode 64, effective strategies for organically growing your podcast, I give you a couple ways to get your podcast in front of the right audiences, because you don't want to be wasting your time trying to promote your podcast in the wrong places. I know your time is valuable and you want to be using it wisely. So today's episode is going to be about pitching. Once you've identified what you need to do to upgrade your podcast, and then you've identified where you need to be promoting your podcast, you'll then need to pitch it to different places, different people. So like I mentioned in the last episode, you really want to be pitching to people who already listen to podcasts, because it's so much easier to get someone who is an avid podcast listener to listen to your show than someone who's never listened to a podcast before. That makes sense, right? So you want to be pitching yourself to get onto podcasts and get in front of those audiences. You want to pitch yourself to podcast apps, podcast newsletters. And so if you're thinking, well, my podcast has been out for a while and I didn't do any pitching from the beginning, that's actually okay, because most shows take time to develop and really hit their stride. So the longer your podcast is out, the better your show is probably going to be, because you've gotten better. You've had time to iron out all the kinks. You've had time to really hone your voice and maybe even pitch to bigger and better guests. So if you haven't pitched your podcast yet, don't worry about it. I would say that giving yourself a little more time to get comfortable behind the mic and to really develop your show is actually a better position to be in because you'll be more confident when you go to pitch. So when you're pitching, you're either going to be pitching to be on a podcast, to a potential sponsor, or to a podcast newsletter. And these all have slightly different approaches. I'm not going to go super into detail of each one. That's something that I will be doing inside my next offer, which I'll talk about at the end of this show. But all pitching starts the same way, and that's with research. So researching who are aligned brands for sponsorships, or who are aligned podcasts, or who has a similar audience to you that you would want to pitch to be a podcast guest. So you really want to do your research first, make a list of 10 to 25 different brands or companies or podcasts that you feel like are a good fit. Either it's a similar audience so that you know you're getting in front of the right audiences if you pitch to podcasts, or if it's a brand, you're making a list of brands that you know, that you like, and that you trust, and that you would feel comfortable talking about on your show. So then you're going to want to research who to reach out to. LinkedIn is a great resource, social media, the company's website. So those are a few places you can go to look for the person to send a pitch to. And you can also see if they have a method for pitching. So for being a podcast guest, I know I have a form on my website that people can apply to be on the show. I collect that information and then I get back to them. I know certain brands will also have pitching criteria or a process for you to go through. If they don't, and it's simply sending an email, that's good information to find out as well. And when you're sending your pitch email, you want to tell them who you are, why your brand aligns with theirs. You want to send any stats that would be helpful for them to know. You want to link to a media kit, and you want to highlight anything that you think would get them to want to work with you. Now, it's always great to ask to set up a call. It could be a virtual coffee or just a connection call where you can get to know the company's representative, the brand's representative, or the podcast host a little bit more. You'll be able to introduce yourself. And for brands, you want to share a personal experience you have with that product. And for being a podcast guest, you definitely want to listen to their episodes, at least 3, minimum 3, because you want to be able to discuss why you think you'll be a good fit for their show. And I want to give tips for once you land the sponsorship opportunity or you land the podcast guest opportunity. If you've landed a partnership or a sponsorship, then you want to make sure that you follow up with a contract, an invoice, and an agreement. So you really want to make sure that you have all of those ducks in a row before you begin pitching. For a podcast guest, you want to follow up with basically a one-page media kit. So you want to have a one-pager that includes all of your links, your bio, your headshot, some key topics that you like to discuss. Like I said, all your links, especially a link to your lead magnet. So you just want to make it easy for the podcast host to have all the information that they need from you. And I like to send that first thing via email so that they don't even have to ask for it. Because the easier you make that process for the podcast host, just the better impression you're going to make. And I just think it's always nice to be super helpful. Like I said, there are a lot of details that go into the process of pitching, either to potential partners or to be a guest on a podcast. There's a different process for pitching to podcast newsletters. So all of this are things that I go over in my Uplevel Your Purposeful podcast offer. It's a new program that I created for those of you who started a podcast and you know that you have something special, and you also know it has so much more potential to grow your business And you want to use this powerful tool to its fullest capabilities. And so that's what I will help you do in the Uplevel Your Purposeful podcast program. So it's a part guided, part instructional experience. You get a few one-on-one sessions with me, and then there are also instructional videos that teach you how to promote your podcast, strategies for growing your podcast effectively. You get a review of your entire podcast, from your description to your episodes to your distribution and your systems. And I make sure that you are not only getting in front of the right people, but your messaging is speaking to the right people. You get 30 days of Voxer support with me because you will have questions, and I love to be here to answer them as you go through the process. And you also get 10 additional resources that are really helpful. So if you maybe tried to do your podcast yourself, but you kind of feel like, I need help. What do I do with this thing that I have? Or, you really want to just be very intentional with your time and get the most out of this podcast, this will be a great program for you. And if you want to learn more about it, you can go to the link in the show notes or podcastamplify.com/up-level, but I'll link to it in the show notes, of course. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me. I am on Instagram at Podcast Amplify, and I'd love to answer any of your questions around this offer or around pitching or around podcasting in general. I want to mention again that this podcast will be going on a summer hiatus. So the last episode will be at the end of June, and we'll be off from July through August, and we'll pick back up again in September. I have some really fantastic women on my calendar already booked to interview, and I'm just excited about this third season because I really believe that as I continue to create this podcast, it just keeps getting better and better. And I'm excited to share that with you in the fall. But I still have a few really great interviews for you this week and next week. And I hope that you stay tuned and listen to those. And if you've missed some episodes, then you have all summer long to binge listen to them. That's all I've got for you today. Thank you so much for listening. I hope this 3-part series was helpful for you. I hope that it answered some of your burning questions around how to grow your podcast, of some of the opportunities that are available to you with a podcast that you might not have been aware of. So thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode. If you loved today's episode, please subscribe so you don't miss a show. And rating and reviewing this podcast is the best way to help support us. Always remember, your voice and what you have to offer is needed in the world. Until next week, take care.